So I've been preaching a couple of times a month up at Layton Church at Grace Pres. They're without a pastor, and they have a pastoral intern, a guy named Nick Winder. And Nick and I have been team preaching through the Gospel of Mark. I say we've been doing it. We've done it like 3 weeks now. And Nick started us off in the Gospel of Mark through the first few verses. And then I did a sermon a few weeks ago on Jesus' baptism. And it has become, this idea of what I'm about to say has become very dear to me in my own heart, in my own life. And it's the one thing I want to say to you this morning. Like, if you don't hear anything else that I say this morning, hear this. That your foundational identity, like the core level, the very beginning of who you are, more than anything else, as a Christian, is that you are beloved sons and daughters of God. Okay, that's it. More than, dare I say it, your political identity, more than your relational identity, more than how much you pray or don't pray, more than how much you obey or don't obey. Your foundational identity that informs everything else, is that you are a beloved child of God. That's where we're going this morning. And my question for you and for me is, will we hear Him this morning? Will you hear Him say to you the same thing that He told Jesus? This is my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased. The same thing that God the Father said to God the Son is the exact same thing that God says to you. Right here, right now. This morning. Will you hear Him? Maybe for the first time, maybe for the first time in a long while. But will you hear Him? This is the same voice that Jesus heard. This, more than anything else, was Jesus' identity. Mark, as well as every other gospel writer, they all talk about Jesus' baptism. John alludes to it. He doesn't talk about it as much as Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. But this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The only other thing we know about Jesus up until this point is what? Remember, he's 12 years old and he's in the temple and he's teaching the Pharisees a thing or two. But he hasn't done anything else. He's just now kind of coming on to the scene. And the way that he starts his ministry is with this mark of being identified as the beloved. Everything that Jesus is, everything that Jesus does is grounded in this identity. Okay, notice the order. What comes first? Identity or doing? Identity. It's not the other way around. We do this all too often. We put our identity in what we do. And that's not it. Jesus' identity, more than anything else, was that He was the beloved Son of God. This is the beginning of His ministry. He hasn't done anything yet. Jesus is defined by who He is. By who God has made Him to be, not by what He does. This is why I think, you guys probably know this. The Old Testament is not super popular right now. Like even amongst evangelical Christians, like we we're New Testament people, right? But one of the reasons the Old Testament is so important is because Jesus doesn't know who He is without it. And look, I get it. The Old Testament's weird. I was in a Bible study a few weeks ago and we were looking at Genesis 19. Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, our 21st century brains, that just doesn't make any sense to us. I get that. But Jesus seems to think that the Old Testament is pretty dang important. Everything that happens in the Old Testament is actually pointing to who He is. He understood Himself in light of everything that happened up to His coming. So, for example, Jesus is the beloved Son who would defeat evil. that was promised in Genesis 3. He is the beloved Son who would sit forever on the throne of David, promised in 2 Samuel. He is the beloved Son who would suffer for the sake of the world, who was promised in Isaiah 53. He is the beloved and faithful Son who is acting out the great drama of Israel coming out of Egypt and wandering into the desert. It's no accident that Jesus goes into the desert for 40 days. Like, that's not just a side note. That is incredibly symbolic. Israel, coming out of slavery, goes into the desert for 40 years. And Jesus, as he eventually dies for the sins of the world, he's being resurrected as the vindicated Messiah. He's the one who does what Israel should have done. He does what you and I should do. All of this wrapped up in his identity as a beloved Son with whom God is well pleased. And it is with this deep, intimate knowledge of his identity that he actually enters into the desert and he stares down the temptations of evil incarnate. Look, if you and I are not grounded in this identity, if we are not convinced more than anything else that we are truly the beloved children of God, that when temptations come, we will not stand. Because they're too much for us. All too often, what you and I do, and this is exactly what Satan does, all too often we find our identity in what we do, and what we have, and what others think of us. And so what Satan does, and Mark doesn't do this, but Luke and Matthew do it, what Satan does is he attacks those very things. You are what you do, Jesus. Turn these stones into bread. You are what others think of you, Jesus. Let the people see angels rescue you when you jump from the temple. You are what you have, Jesus. You can have all these kingdoms if you will worship me. Jesus, grounded in the identity of his belovedness, does exactly what Israel did not. He was faithful. He did not give in to those temptations. He did not give in to the false promises of a false identity. Keep in mind, I think we lose this way too often. Keep in mind that Jesus was tempted in every way just as you and I are. Which includes not being able to believe that we are the beloved. Remember, the author of Hebrews says that Jesus is not someone who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus was tempted in every way, just as you and I are. This is why Mark and Matthew and Luke and John, to some degree, this is why they make a big deal about Jesus being baptized in the first place. In Matthew, it's so great. In Matthew, Jesus comes to John and says, hey, I need you to baptize me. And John argues with him. Can you imagine getting into a kind of back and forth with Jesus? John says, you should be baptizing me, not the other way around. And what does Jesus say? He's like, no, you have to baptize me because this is to fulfill all righteousness. There's a lot there. But one of the things that is going on there is that when Jesus is baptized, what he's doing more than anything else is he's identifying with you and I. He is identifying with all of humanity, in all of our weaknesses, in all of our temptations. He is identifying with us. He is so identifying with humanity that he takes on even the weaknesses of our temptation. Now, I know because I've wrestled with this. The question we ask is, yeah, but he's Jesus. Like, he's the eternal Son of God. If anybody can stand up to temptations, it's him, and it's not that big of a deal. That's not true. We have to keep in mind, right? We have to hold these two things together, that Jesus is both 100% God and 100% man, and everything that comes with that. So when he is tempted, it is real. But let me ask you guys this. Who knows the incredible strength of the temptation more than the person who doesn't give into it? Think of it this way. You got a U.S. Army tank coming right at you. and you go to stick your hands out and stop it, and it just runs right over you, and you're gone like that. You don't even know what happened. You hardly even felt anything. Then imagine a U.S. Army tank coming at you full speed, and you put your hands out, and you stop it, and you hold it. Who knows the real strength of that tank? The one that was killed by it instantly, or the one who's holding it back? Jesus doesn't give in. He holds it at bay. And he knows the true strength of it. I would argue that Jesus knows the strength of our temptations better than we do, exactly because he doesn't give in. So this is why, and I know I'm rambling here a little bit, but this is why we have to get the true identity of Jesus right. It is, it's very common, you guys know this, it is even in the church, it is very common that people see Jesus as simply an example, right? He's an example for us to follow. He's a moral teacher that we can learn from. He's one more spiritual guru who sets us on the right path to our own divinity. This is what is some very common kind of popular views of Jesus. But if we miss his true identity, if we miss him as the eternal Son of God, then where does that leave us? It leaves us simply finding our identity in what we do, what we have, and how others view us. Like, that's all we got. But if our identity is wrapped up in this belovedness of who Jesus is, then we can rest, knowing that we are the beloved of God. One writer says this, one pastor says this, the whole Christian gospel could be summed up in this point. That when the living God looks at you, when he looks at us, at every baptized and believing Christian, he says to us what he said to Jesus on that day. He sees us not as we are in ourselves, but as who we are in Jesus Christ. You know, there's a handful of debates amongst church history. Just a few. Believe it or not, we haven't always agreed on everything. But one of the few things that we have agreed on is that when we are baptized, that we are then being identified with Jesus. Our Westminster Confession of Faith in the Shorter Catechism says that in our baptism, that our baptism signifies and seals our engrafting into Christ. It means we are in him. We are united to him. But contrary to popular belief, the Bible actually says better things than the Westminster Confession of Faith. Paul says over and over again that you and I are in Christ, that we are with Christ, that in our baptism we are united to Jesus in his baptism. We are united to him in his death and in his resurrection. What that means for you and I is that Jesus' righteousness is your righteousness. Jesus' obedience is your obedience. Jesus' holiness is your holiness. Jesus' identity is your identity. Jesus' belovedness is your belovedness. It is yours. I think the last time I was here, I quoted Dave Matthews. Ray loved it. I don't know if anyone else does. Let me tell you a little bit about U2. So look, I'm 43 years old. I'm white. I'm balding, right? So like Dave Matthews and U2, like that's all I got musically. Love U2. My son and I got to go see them a couple of summers ago in St. Louis. But a few years ago, they were on U2 were on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, and they were right in the middle of their Joshua Tree tour. One of the best albums ever, right? And if they're promoting their Joshua Tree tour, and if they're playing live, of course they're going to play a song from Joshua Tree, which means they have to play I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. So they did that. They broke into this beautiful live version of what I still haven't found looking for. But here's the coolest part: is that not only were they performing, that throughout the audience, Jimmy Kimmel's production crew had put up mics in random places. And so what that meant is that people could come up to the mic and they could sing with Bono. So while Bono's belting out, "I've climbed the highest mountains, I've run through the fields only to be with you," Joe Schmo from Indiana was singing the exact same thing. And it was awful. But it didn't matter, because it wasn't his song. It was Bono's song. It wasn't his voice, it was Bono's voice. It wasn't his performance. It was Bono's performance. Your identity is not based on your performance. It's based on the performance of another. This is a unique position of Christianity. That Jesus, as the beloved Son of God, actually makes you the beloved son and daughter of God. Not based on your performance. Based on the performance of another. If you do not believe that your foundational identity as a Christian is that you're the beloved, then you will go after the same things that Satan offers Jesus. And we do this all the time. So often we question, who am I really? What is my identity? And I alluded to this earlier, but we live in a culture that leads us to identify ourselves in these three main ways: what I do, what I have, and what others think of me. And look, I get this. What we do is a good thing. Your job, your calling, your vocation, that's a good thing. What you have, those are good things. God has given us gifts to enjoy. What other people think about you, your reputation, those are good things. Those are fine. But when you make those things your identity, that's when we get into trouble, because those three things will come and go. You guys know this. I know this. Those three things come and go. If we build our vocation, if we build our foundational identity on those three things, what we begin to realize is that those three things are a very, very unstable, shakeable foundation. Some of you probably played the game Jenga, right? You know, you're trying to stack wooden blocks up high. So you take one block and put it on the top. What happens? The more you start taking those things from the bottom and put them up top, you're just waiting for any moment for that thing to fall. And then you get to yell, "Jenga!" Like, if our identity is in these three things, that's what it's like. It's just shaky. It's just unstable. It's not going to last. Because inevitably, one or all of these, what we do, what we have, what others think of us, every last one of them will fall. We are so frail and so weak. We hate to admit this, but we are. That all it takes sometimes is a harsh word, right? That's all it takes. All it takes is a loss of job or loss of good health. All it takes is that finding out that people do not think as highly as you think they did. What happens when your identity is found in your parenting skills and your children don't turn out the way that you think they should? What happens when your identity is found in your bank account and then you lose your job? What happens when your identity is found in your relationships and those relationships are no longer what they once were? What happens when your identity is found in your morality and you find yourself giving into the same sin time and time again? What happens when your identity is found in your body image and you don't quite look the same as you did when you were 25? In my own life, I've noticed that there's been this journey for me, and maybe some of you can relate. As I've described it this way, God has put me on this journey from performer to beloved. I am one of those people that deeply finds their identity in what I do. And so several years ago when I was working on my counseling degree, each one of us had to have a supervisor. And the supervisor was to listen to your tapes in counseling and then tell you what you could do better. And so my very first counseling session, I met with this guy who was a complete sex addict. And I spent 50 minutes with him. And I walked out of that meeting with him and I thought, man, I am good. I nailed it. I had my tape. Back then, we had cassette tapes. I handed it to my supervisor. We met a week later, and I was expecting him to say, hey, here's what you did. Well, here's where you could have improved on. He sat me down, and he looked at me. He's like, hey, I listened to your tape. I got one question for you. Why do you feel the need to perform? Ouch. But we all do that. And I am telling you that the more this identity, this idea that you are the beloved, the more it begins to seep down into you, it changes everything. Everything else will come and go. But not your identity as the beloved. That cannot be undone. It cannot change. If this truth sinks down into the depths of your heart, it will change you. At the very least, it will free you from being tormented by this crazy roller coaster thing that we call life. One writer says this, as we learn to live as the beloved, it teaches us to experience life as a pilgrimage. It's a journey. It's not arriving. It's not getting your act together. It's a pilgrimage. It's a poem already written. It's a symphony being conducted by the Father who loves and delights in His children. So then, does life become easy? No. Does it start to make sense? Not in the least bit. But at the very least, when you are in the wilderness, which you and I experience pretty often, that even when we are in the wilderness, we can still hear the Father say to us, you are my beloved. And the question is how? How do we hear that voice? And I'm going to end with a couple of things. One will be pretty practical. One takes some more time, I think. How do you hear that voice? The first way is this, is that you and I, we have to take the time to be quiet. Literally. Literally. Not just like in our hearts and our minds or whatever. No. Find yourself a place in your house. Set a timer if you have to. And start with 5 minutes. And just sit there. Don't do anything. Don't do anything. Now look, I know that this is hard. I know this is hard to do because the second that we turn off the TV, the second we turn off the music, the second we take out our headphones, all these other voices start creeping in. You're not lovely. You're not worthy. I'll love you if you do enough. I'll love you if you perform well enough. But the whole point of sitting and just stopping and not doing anything for 5 minutes is so that you're not doing anything and know that you are still loved. So I do this weird thing. Most mornings, I set a timer, and for however long, I breathe in. I say, I belong to Jesus. And then I breathe out, and I say, I am the beloved. And I've been doing that for a few years now, and slowly but surely, I'm actually starting to believe it. And it is life-changing. So just sit. Know that even when you're not doing anything, when you're not being productive, that you are loved. We are constantly trying to do things for Jesus But I don't know if we have any idea how to just be with Jesus. I'm imploring you. I'm imploring all of us that what we do, that we begin to learn that what we do for Him flows out of learning to be with Him. It's not the other way around. Think of it, if you think about the Gospels, that oftentimes Jesus is what? After He's done a ton, He's often withdrawing to desolate places to be by Himself and to be with the Father. We have to learn how to do that. We have to slow down. We have to take the time to be quiet. Because nobody else is. So first, just sit and be quiet. Second is this. Is that you and I, we have to hear the deafening silence of the cross. Okay, I want you to think about this for a second. Between Malachi, so the end of the Old Testament, and when Jesus hears this voice at His baptism, we're talking 400 years of God's silence. God's people haven't heard anything from Him. No prophets, no major miracles, no nothing. The first time they hear God's voice is at Jesus' baptism. And then they hear it a second time in Jesus' ministry, at the Transfiguration, when it's just Peter, James, and John. Jesus hears the same thing. They hear the same thing. This is my beloved Son. Listen to Him. Okay? So twice now Jesus has heard that. The audible voice of the Father. And then Jesus is on the cross. And He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And what does He hear then? Nothing. Silence. Why doesn't Jesus hear anything then? So that you and I can hear something now. The silence at the cross is God's way of screaming at us. I love you. I am for you. I am with you. Nothing will ever change that. That is what you must hear. We get so caught up in thinking that we're loved because of what we do or because of what we believe or because of some denominational ties that we have or political ties or anything else. That's why I said at the beginning, none of those things matter in light of your identity as the beloved. When Jesus is baptized, it says what? This beautiful thing. The heavens were torn open. The heavens were torn open. When Jesus is crucified, the veil is torn in two. Why? So that you can hear the voice of God say to you, you are my beloved. You have to hear it. Now look, there are other voices. There will always be other voices. You hear them, I hear them. And this is why we have to be quiet so that we can hear the voice of our Father. Ray Cortez is a pastor down in Florida, and he always uses great illustrations. And I've never had an original thought before in my life, and so I'm always stealing his illustrations. But he tells a story of a pastor who went through 7 years of oppression, 7 years of emotional torture, 7 years in which his emotions and his brain, he felt like were failing him. 7 years in which he had nightmares every night. And all of this happening while he was pastoring a church. 7 years of getting up every morning and asking God to keep the evil away from him. And at one point he turned to his wife and he says this, I'm going crazy. I'm losing my mind. They are going to come for me and take me away and put me in a padded room. And his wife did this. His wife took his face in her hands, looked him in the eyes, and said to him, if they come for you and put you in a padded room, then I will grab my sleeping bag and I will go into that room with you because I love you. and I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you. And when that pastor says, he says, my wife's voice of love is what saved me. You have to hear the voice of God's love saying to you, you are my beloved. In you, with you, I am well pleased. Let me pray.